Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Murders at Karlov Manor draft guide. In this video, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to find success in your Murders at Karlov Manor drafts. The first thing we'll be covering are the mechanics, because most of the cards don't make sense without them. First up is Disguise. A Disguise card can be played normally by paying its casting cost, or for 3 mana, you can play it in Disguise as a face-down 2/2 with Ward 2. If you play a card in Disguise, you can later flip it face-up anytime you have priority by paying its Disguise cost. The flip happens immediately and doesn't use the stack, so it can't be responded to. Usually, Disguise cards flip into creatures, and in that case, the creature stays the same except it is now face-up. So if it was attacking, it stays attacking, and so forth. Pretty straightforward. The real mystery comes when you try to figure out what's hiding face down, but luckily there is the rule of 5 to help out. The rule of 5 is that a disguised creature cannot flip to win combat against another disguised creature for less than 5 mana. That means if your opponent has less than 5 lands in play, you can feel confident trading your disguised creatures in combat since their attacker won't flip into a creature that can eat your blocker. The next new mechanic is Cloak. It is not found on many cards in the set, but if it comes up, a cloaked creature is also a face-down 2/2 with Ward 2, but it can only flip up face up if it is a creature. To flip a cloaked creature, you pay the casting cost of the face-down creature anytime you have priority. If you have a disguised creature that was put into play from a cloaking ability, then you can alternatively pay its disguise cost to flip it face up. The next mechanic is Investigate. When you investigate, you make a clue token, which is an artifact that you can sacrifice to draw a card by paying 2 mana. Easy peasy. Next up, we have Suspect. When a creature becomes suspected, it gains menace and loses the ability to block. It remains a suspect until it leaves play or an effect says it is no longer suspected. Almost all of the suspect cards involve suspecting your own creatures, so you'll mostly be using it as an aggressive mechanic to provide some evasiveness. But occasionally, you can use it to make a creature unable to block. Keep in mind that multiple creatures can be suspected at once. Next up is Collect Evidence, a mechanic that is always followed by a number, such as Collect Evidence 3. Each time you're asked to collect evidence, exile any number of cards from your graveyard with total mana value of the indicated number or greater. This could be one high mana value card, many low mana value cards, or somewhere in between. What matters is the total mana value exiled, not the card count or card type. If you can't meet the full collect evidence value, you don't get to collect evidence at all. Finally, we have Cases. A case is a new type of enchantment with 3 abilities. The top ability is always active. The middle ability, preceded by To Solve, sets out the conditions under which you can solve the case. At the beginning of your end step, if a case is unsolved, and if you've met the condition described in the middle ability, the case becomes solved. Note that the condition must be true as your end step begins and as the ability tries to resolve. Once a case is solved, the middle To Solve ability will no longer trigger, and the final ability becomes active. If that ability is an activated ability, it can now be activated. If it is a triggered ability, it can now trigger. If it's a static ability, that ability now functions. Once a case is solved, it stays solved until it leaves the battlefield. If a case does leave the battlefield and then returns, it's a new case that returns unsolved and must be solved again. With new play boosters, there is a small chance of your packs having a card from the list. Any card you open can be picked and played, so don't be intimidated if you occasionally see a card that isn't in the main set, and definitely consider picking them if they seem good for your deck. Now that we've covered the mechanics, you'll have a much better understanding of the cards, so we'll move on to the top commons. These are worth prioritizing in your drafts, and you can even view them as signals if you get them with late picks. Let's kick things off with white. At number 1 is Novice Inspector. It is excellent in any strategy, is a great play on turn 1, and is even a solid draw late thanks to the clue it provides. Overall, you will be happy to take them early and play as many as you can. At number 2 is Market Watch Phantom. A 2-mana 2/2 flyer is a stellar card. and this is deceptively close to that. With disguised creatures often coming into play as 3-mana 2/2s, your deck is going to have lots of cards to trigger this, and to help you push through some major damage. At number 3 is Makeshift Binding. Removal for a creature of any size that even gains you some life along the way is excellent, and this is a card you will be happy to play in any white deck. Moving on to blue, at number 1 we have Dramatic Accusation. It is not a flashy card, but because blue usually doesn't get such efficient removal, it is worth prioritizing. The activated ability means that it is also less vulnerable to cards that would traditionally be good against this effect. At number 2 is Out Cold. It is a bit expensive at 4 mana, but it is devastating at the top of your curve in an aggressive deck, buys you tons of time in your controlling decks, and replaces itself thanks to the clue, so you're always pretty happy playing it. It also sends a 4 mana value card to your graveyard, which is pretty nice if you need to collect evidence. Number 3 is Crime Stopper Sprite. An evasive 3 mana creature that provides a solid tempo advantage is worth prioritizing, and the more you are able to facilitate its collect evidence ability, the better it gets. Next up is black, and at number 1 is Murder. Efficient removal at instant speed is premium and worth taking early. Number 2 is Unscrupulous Agent. A 2-drop that provides a speed bump and nabs a card from the opponent is a solid addition to your team, and is especially good if you can use the body for something extra, like sacrificing for value. At 3 is Snarling Gorehound, which is a solid 1-drop that will chip in for evasive damage, smooth your draws, and even help fill your graveyard if you have synergies that care about that. It doesn't scale particularly well into the game, but if you're playing an aggressive strategy, it is just what you're looking for. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Galvanize, which is one of the most absurd commons I've ever seen. 2 mana to deal 3 at instant speed is already excellent, and the fact that you can sometimes have a 2 mana deal 5 is incredible. Number 2 is Shock, which is a solid way to impact the board state for just 1 mana. Occasionally burning out your opponents is nice upside too. At number 3 is Person of Interest. This is just a rock solid creature, as 4 power and 4 toughness spread across 2 bodies is a nice recipe. It lines up well against removal, plays well with things like equipment, and overall is a card you're happy to have that plays better than it might look at first glance. Last up, we have green, and at number 1 is Nervous Gardener. A solid 2-for-1 creature at common is really nice, and playing this on turn 3 before flipping it on turn 4 to ensure your land drop is a nice play pattern. The fact that you can also just deploy it on turn 2 is further upside on a nice card. At number 2 is Loxodon Eavesdropper. Another 2-for-1 creature in green is great, and this actually has a decent stat line, especially when you trigger its ability to swing in for 4 with Vigilance. Coming in at number 3 is Tunnel Tipster. With all of the value green's other cards can provide, it is nice to have a way to accelerate them out. Tipster is great at ramping you in the early game, but can also become pretty sizable if you play enough disguise creatures. Even just making it a 2/2 is great, and the fact that it can be even bigger, and that all of this is attached to a mana dork is fantastic. Now that we've touched on the colors, here's a quick ranking. Red, white, and green are all fairly close at the top, and then there's a bit of a gap to blue and black. But I want to note that all of the colors are playable, and it is better to find the open lane in the draft than it is to force a color because it is slightly stronger. The color ranking is best used as a tiebreaker for a close pick. Now that we've covered the marquee commons, we'll go over each of the 2-color archetypes so you can see what sorts of decks you will be building with these tools. First up is red-white, an aggressive deck that cares about attacking with 3 or more creatures. Dog Walker is the perfect play in this deck, as it will make 3 creatures all by itself if you disguise it, perfect for fueling your synergies. Meddling Youths provides a great top-end threat, because if you curve out with creatures, you'll have a big haster to hit for a chunk of damage and help you dig towards the spells you need to end the game. Karlov Watchdog is also great in this strategy because it will buff your team when you make big attacks, which is what you're trying to do anyway. Blue-black is a clues control deck, which means it tries to extend the game with defensive spells and then crack clues in the late game to pull ahead on cards and win. Curious Cadaver is the ideal card to trade off with opposing creatures and then continually buy back to eventually win in the skies. Coerced to Kill is another excellent gold card that provides a clean 2-for-1, and Undercity Eliminator is a nice top-end threat that will often kill an opposing creature because you will almost always have a clue to feed to its ability at that stage of the game. With blue-black, just remember that slow and steady solves the case. Green-white is a deck that cares about going wide with a huge board state of disguised creatures. Sumala Sentry is the perfect early play, as it will grow both itself and your other creatures as you deploy disguised threats. Greenbelt Radical is a particularly powerful in this build if you can develop a wide board state, as it will grow all your creatures when you flip it from disguise. Finally, Crowd Control Warden is a common that feels right at home here, as it works with disguise cards and having a wide board, just what the doctor ordered. Blue-red is an artifact sacrifice deck. You will use clue tokens to pull ahead on cards, and Thopters to chip away in the skies while you wait to draw payoffs that let you sacrifice them for even better effects. Gleaming Geardrake is excellent as an early play that grows into a devastating threat over time, and even comes with a clue to provide card advantage. Detective's Satchel is another nice card for this strategy, as it provides a steady stream of Thopters when you are able to facilitate it. Cornered Crook is another excellent payoff for having some disposable artifacts in play, with a huge body and a very relevant artifact sacrificing ability. Green-black is a graveyard deck that gives you extra value when creatures leave your graveyard. This includes collect evidence cards if you are exiling creatures to pay for those abilities, as well as cards that return creatures from your graveyard to your hand or directly to play. Insidious Roots is a nice payoff that starts off slow but can quickly ramp up to make an army of plants if you have the right synergy around it. Speaking of synergy, Leering Onlooker is a perfect enabler for this strategy, as it has a self-contained way to remove itself from the graveyard for value, fueling your payoffs along the way. Finally, Chalk Outline is a bit clunky to set up, but if you can trigger it a couple times, you'll easily be able to pull ahead on cards and creatures while you grind your way to victory. Blue-white is a detective mid-range strategy that can get off to some quick starts. Leverage detective synergies to boost your power level, and clues to refill in the late game, and your opponents will be trying to solve the case of how they lost. Private Eye is the perfect tribal payoff for this strategy, as it buffs your other detectives and even provides some evasion to help you push damage. Case of the Pilfered Proof also fits right in, buffing your detectives and eventually helping you bury your opponents in a mountain of evidence. Projector Inspector is a nice comment for this strategy, as it will filter your draws to help you find more detectives, but is also a way to trigger some draw-to payoffs like Private Eye. Red-green is about ramping and playing disguise creatures that flip into big threats. Tin Street Gossip is a nice ramp card if you build your deck correctly, and thanks to Vigilance, it can even attack for chunks of damage before powering out your disguise threats. Bolrak Clan Basher is a big creature that plays especially well with tricks thanks to Double Strike and Trample, while Culvert Ambusher provides another sizable disguise threat with nice utility. Black-white is also a disguise deck, but it focuses on small creatures. Using payoffs that care about creatures with 2 or less power, you can show your foes that might doesn't always make right. Wispweaver Vampire will leverage your small army to slowly drain your opponent out, culminating with a big swing if you can activate its ability. Neighborhood Guardian is a nice aggressive threat that can enable some attacks while you develop your board state, and Slimy Dual Leech makes sure you can continue attacking by providing your little creatures with Death Touch and a small power boost. When counting your number of small creatures for this deck, remember that all of your face-down disguise creatures are 2/2s. Green-blue is all about collecting evidence, and is the best at filling up its graveyard to enable powerful plays later. Evidence Examiner is a nice early creature that makes you clues while you collect evidence, and Aftermath Analyst is also great to deploy early because it provides some self-mill to fuel your graveyard evidence engine. Expensive disguise cards are also nice for this purpose because you can play them for 3, and when they die, they have big mana values on their front side that can be used to collect evidence. Forensic Researcher is a great payoff for this deck, as it provides ramp and utility with its first ability, and a bit of pseudo removal with its second ability if you have a full graveyard. It's also a nice way to trigger cards that care about collecting evidence while getting some value along the way. Finally, Black-Red is an aggressive deck that uses the Suspect mechanic to keep the pressure on, giving its own creatures menace and not caring about the downside because it's pretty much only interested in attacking anyway. Runebrand Juggler is a nice way to make an evasive threat early, and can turn your smaller suspects into relevant removal if the game goes long. Clandestine Meddler also gets the suspecting rolling early, while providing some card filtering, and Frantic Scapegoat is another nice source of early pressure while fueling suspect synergies and aggression. Try to keep your foot on the gas, because if you fall behind, not being able to block is a real downside. Now that we've discussed the top commons and the archetypes, we'll wrap up this draft guide with some key info. First up, these are the common combat tricks in the set. It's good to be aware of them, so if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, you'll know the most likely cards they could have. White has Auspicious Arrival for 2 mana and On the Case as a mass pump spell for 4 mana. Blue has Behind the Mask to provide some trickery for 1 mana. Black has Toxin Analysis for 1 mana. Red has Felonious Rage for 1 mana, and The Chase is On for 3 mana. And green has Fanatical Strength for 2 mana and Airtight Alibi for 3 mana. Next, we have the common disguise cards in the set. You'll want to know these so you have a good idea of what is lurking face down. White has Museum Nightwatch that disguises for 2, and Defenestrated Phantom that disguises for 5. Blue has Bubble Smuggler that disguises for 6. Black has Basilica Stalker that disguises for 5, and Alley Assailant that disguises for 6. Red has Offender at Large that disguises for 5, and green has Nervous Gardener that disguises for 1, and Vengeful Creeper that disguises for 6. It is important to emphasize that the flexibility provided by disguise cards makes them quite powerful. The option to play them as 3 mana 2/2s with Ward 2, regardless of your mana situation, is huge, as it gives you reliable access to cards that impact the board early, and that often provide you with late game mana sinks as well. There is also a common disguiser in each of the color pairs. While they will usually be played in their 2-color archetype, it is worth noting that because of the hybrid mana cost on their disguise abilities, they can also be played in decks that are just one of their main colors, as they can still be cast face down and flipped in those decks. Next, we'll be looking at the common mana fixing in the set, starting with the colorless options. Escape Tunnel is the best of these, as a tap land that can get your main colors or your splash is quite valuable. The ability to sneak through damage with Tunnel is also great upside, and is a reason to try to keep your life total above 2 if possible. Public Thoroughfare is a bit more niche to include, as having to pay mana or tap an artifact, in addition to the Thoroughfare entering tapped, is a major cost. If you are planning on splashing multiple colors though, it can be useful in that role. Rounding out the colorless fixing at common is Gravestone Strider, which is a bit less reliable because it is a creature that can be killed. For this reason, it is safer to view this as more of a supplementary mana fixer than as a full color source like a land. Green also has abundant mana fixing in this set, even at common. Topiary Panther is a cheap way to make sure you hit your land drops, and being able to get any basic land is excellent if you are trying to splash. Panther also plays well with Collect Evidence because it puts a 6 mana value card into your graveyard early on, which can then be used to fuel Collect Evidence. They Went This Way is another nice source of fixing, as it ramps you, fixes you, and even gives you a card back thanks to the clue token. Nervous Gardener rounds out Green's common fixing, and as we already discussed in the top commons, it is excellent. Moving on to some final tips, and the first one is don't play scared. It's easy to think that a face-down card could be anything, but if you take the time to learn the commons, and especially if you remember what your opponent played during earlier games in a match, you can remove a lot of the worry. Giving your opponent credit for every disguised creature at once is giving up a big edge, so be prepared and play with confidence. Remember the rule of 5, and expect that your 2/2s will trade with disguised creatures unless 5 mana is available. Finally, in this set, it is important to have a game plan with your deck. Lots of the mechanics reward focused deck building, so try to make sure all of your cards work together. For example, having a random suspect card in a grindy green-black or blue-black deck is often a liability, since the suspect won't be able to block and stall the game to advance your plan and work with your other cards. On a similar note, having too many Collect Evidence cards in a deck that can't reliably fuel the graveyard is just asking for trouble, as your cards will be a bit underpowered without their mechanic. By having a plan, you can maximize your cards and unlock their full potential. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more videos, comment if you have any questions or feedback, and to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag #DetectiveDrafter in the comments section down below.